basically small pond stuff. And small ponds around here, the primary interest is pond management. I think I'll go sit down. Okay. This is going to be a really, really fast crash course in pond management, by the way, just to let you know. Okay. So a lot of this stuff, the pond you're looking at right here, of course, you've already been to. This is Power Pond. This is not. So when you build a pond, and so this is all about pond construction here. The best sort of, if the watershed is wooded, that's the best you can go with. Second best is shrubby or grassy. And then basically this is what the sort of areas you want to avoid. Having said that, a lot of ponds end up in these sort of areas all the time. Especially the ponds I used to work at when I was in Memphis were all in developed areas. And again, livestock crop production, you're just in exposed soils. As I mentioned when we were out in the field, that ponds have a life. They're born, they live, and they die. And those exposed soils, livestock, what kills them is sedimentation and vegetation coming in. So that's why you want to avoid a lot of that sort of stuff. Soil type, okay, so that makes sense. Rocky and sandy soils, of course, don't hold water. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. If you can avoid it, then avoid it. If you can't avoid it, if that's just where you're going to make your pond, then there's certain tricks you have to do to make sure that that your pond doesn't leak. Okay, so clay soils are the best for this sort of material here. And there are ways, if you don't have all clay soils, that you can stop the pond from leaking. Okay. So some of the tricks are, first of all, you got your area. This is called a sheep's foot roller. If you've ever seen any of these, they're pretty common around construction sites. The purpose is to compact the soils. They do much better than a smooth roller. We're shoving soils down and making them nice and tight. Okay. Another thing you can do then is, while this is all done before the pond is full, by the way, is to add clays to the soils to try to, and then again rub those in, try to mix those in with the sandy, rocky soils. This is a material here which is often used. This is called sodium bentonite. Sometimes it's just referred to as bentonite. Bentonite is a real fine clay that's mined in places. This is what bentonite rocks look like, and then these are then crushed into a fine powder. And the reason why bentonite is used, not only is it a fine powder clay-like particle, but it swells. So when you put bentonite in, it'll swell up and block any of the holes any of the pores that might be causing the pond to leak. And this is another method here. These are called dispersants, which are somewhat similar. What they do is they also sort of fill in. What you're looking at here are basically looking at these are in prices. So the cheapest thing to do is compaction, but it also may not be the best. Addition of just regular clay is good. Sodium bentonite is better. This is kind of expensive, putting these dispersants on. And then the big time thing to do are liners. And liners are all, so what you're looking at here, this is a pond, this is was built as a sewage lagoon for hog sewage. And hog sewage lagoons have to be, they cannot drain into groundwater. So this is a fine example of why you would use these sort of things. Where you see them in more, other than lagoons, on golf courses they're used a lot. Places like this where you have smaller water features, they'd be extremely expensive to do this on any size pond of an acre or more. Speaking of which, pond placement and size, this is a pretty good setup for a pair of ponds here. Most of that watershed is grasses or trees, and I'm sure that there's inflows coming down right down through the trees. you want to have, remember the watershed you want to be treed, but you want, where you're going to put your pond, you want it to be kind of open. You don't have to go through and remove a whole bunch of trees. And the areas you're using here, and I talked about this when we were at Pellerit's house, is you don't put ponds on actively running streams. That's not, you do streams that are periodic or intermittent, and these are often called, basically they just run when they have storm events. So they convey or carry stormwater. So you want to use the site of stormwater conveyance. So this, you block these off, you're not really destroying aquatic habitats. Basically most of this is relatively terrestrial, and then you're just collecting water to fill into these areas. Again, so avoid permanent streams and wetlands, of course. I said that. In terms of size, really an acre is pretty darn small. So you basically, anything smaller than an acre, you don't want to be building. It's not going to last long. It's going to be hard to manage. You're going to have some real problems. Depths, usually maximum depth on ponds of this size, you're looking at about 12 feet. That's the max, so 9 to 12 feet. Generally, these ponds average anywhere between 4 and 6 feet in depth, and then right along the shoreline, they quickly go down to 3 feet fast. Right? You want the shoreline. Basically, you want the shoreline to be somewhat steep, but not too steep. If it's too steep, you're going to get erosion. But if it's not steep enough, then you're going to get enhanced plant development. And so this is basically a lot of stuff that I talked about when we were walking on Pellerit's Dam. So first of all, I mentioned that there's a solid clay core. All right, so again, so all of this here, so this is the pond now that we built, but basically, before it was there, this was the ground surface. They excavate out of the ground surface here, and then this is filled with clay. Okay, and then you pretty much use clay on the inside all the way up, and then cover it with soil over the top. Okay, so, and this is this clay core, so you're going to get seepage coming through here, and that's going to help stop it. I'll get over it. Okay, width versus height. It's usually width is 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 height, and then to keep it from erosion, basically on the impoundment itself, you use a lot of grass. Everywhere else in the watershed is treed if you can, because that's going to, trees and shrubs tend to stop overland flow. They're going to carry stuff in. But the dam itself is planted in grass, and the dam is maintained in grass. You don't want, we covered that all pretty well out in the field. A lot of the stuff is going to sound real familiar. And so in our picture here, position number 8 here is the outflow of the dam. And this is just showing a standard pipe. And I mentioned these flashings that are down through the pipe, but the job of them is, if water is seeping along that pipe, that it retards that flow to keep this from blowing out. Okay, so most of these ponds, constructed ponds, if done properly, is basically a drain pipe or a standpipe. Difference between a drain pipe and a standpipe. The standpipes tend to be vertical. Okay. This is something that was not at Dr. Pellerit's pond. It's not too much. It's not really an issue because he has the second pipe over top. He has the pipe sleeve, so the water never gets to the top of that pipe. So that's why he gets away with that. This is called a grate or trash rack to keep stuff, mostly turtles and things like that, from going into the pipe and blocking it up. This is what Dr. Pellerit had. This is the diverter, like I was talking about. The outside, and he has a very high diverter. Sits here. So basically, this pipe, the inside pipe standpipe goes out to the outside, and then this pipe on the outside there's a big open space at the bottom. So when the water comes in to match the water over here, it's coming in from the bottom, and then it feeds out off the side like this. So it's a very clever way of drawing bottom water out of the pond, which is really what you want. Because that's crappy water. You don't want to take out the surface water. And I already mentioned the anti-seep collars that go down along the side of that. On the lower side, basically it has what's called a gate valve, or a flapper gate. So when the water is coming out of the pond, the gate is open. But if the water starts to build up down below, it basically shuts to keep things from going back up into the pipe. I also mentioned this, that somewhere on the dam you have an intentional low spot. This is the emergency overflow spillway. If something were to happen to the standpipe and it would get too high, it's going to put pressure on the dam somewhere. The water's going to come running over, and if it does, it's going to erode the dam there. So the best thing to do is know where that's going to happen. In this case here, this one is armored, and in fact, this is basically concrete on this. If it was to overflow, it would be flowing down concrete, and that'll keep it from doing that. Sometimes it's sod, sometimes there's a bunch of stones, depends on how they've done it. So to keep that water from eroding into the dam. Okay, in-pond structures, again, we talked about this, and we saw a bunch of these out here. So this is just a small corner of a pond here. Whoever built part of this pond, this much more pond than I'm showing here in this picture, what they did was they put a little island in the middle of it to sort of give it a little bit of structure, more shoreline. Okay. In some places, rock is used, and rock is called riprap. Riprap provides a little bit of heterogeneity, but its big importance is it stops erosion. So what you see in a lot of places on the Mississippi River and elsewhere is primarily for erosion. In December, usually, actually probably in January, another habitat is to add Christmas trees to ponds. Again, it provides cover. Basically what you do is the tree is tied to a cinder block and then dropped into the pond, and that provides cover. So they become quite plentiful in late December. Other things too are, this is a fish attractor. Again, structure when it comes to productivity, these do not increase productivity. What they do is they just give habitat to the smaller fish. Okay, so here's some pictures of, again, this is Peller's Pond. This is well past construction. This is what it looked like originally. So when we first walked into the area here, I said we stood out on this point right here. So you can see it's a pretty deep pond. It's down about 12 to 15 feet. Now, remember, there's a wood duck house up here now, and you're seeing in this pond, there's this diverters here. It's not been put in yet, and you're seeing these cinder blocks in various locations at the bottom. And I'll point out these tanks. These are the milk jugs that I talked about before. The big milk things turned on their sides without their lid, so he's planning for catfish. So here's what the diverter looks like in pieces. So the smaller pipe, again, will go here into this, go up. This is the larger pipe, which then will sit basically on a pole down here. So it rests between the pole and on the horizontal end of the elbow. And it sits up here, so you've got all this space down below for water to come up through the diverter. That's the diverter in place. Again, you can see when the pond, when ponds are first built, they're never pretty. Okay, so either they fill too slowly or they fill too quickly. His filled quickly, so he's planted warm season grasses on there to try to hold his soils in. There was much too much rain too quickly, and of course the turbidity is extremely high. It looks like shit when you first build a lake. There's just no two ways about it. And this is an older picture here. So you see along the thaw leg Talveg is where they've got those cans laid out. And what he's gonna do later is he's got the cinder blocks laid out, so he's gonna tie trees into those areas too. There's another picture right here, and of course we saw the remnants of this tree pile here. Still a little bit there that we saw some of that sticking out here. These other ones here, we didn't see because they were deep underwater. And these are the Christmas tree ones here. We saw one of these stick beds, I think we saw this stick bed. Didn't see this one because it was all the way underwater. And this is the 4x4s where the dock is going to be. And then there's that table I was talking about, okay, that he built. He's never used it, but that table there. That's
terrible table.
Terrible table for fertilization. Here's his inflow coming through under here from the upstream area. Okay. All right, when it comes to what the next is, okay, so you built the pond, it's cleaned up and all that. The fish aren't gonna suddenly appear out of nowhere. You have to stock these ponds. So, who do we stock? Who are the desirable species? So basically, in Tennessee, there are 3 species which are always stocked together. Again, and I talked about this when we were out at the pond, so I mentioned
It was bass, bluegill, and red ear.
Yeah, that's what they are. So, largemouth bass, bluegill, and red ear sunfish, often called shellcrackers. So, yeah. And in this sort of setup here, both red ear sunfish and bluegill are game fish in their own right, but in addition, they're also feeder fish for the largemouth bass. So that's, again, why you use 2 different ones is bluegill, instead of just using all bluegill, or you never use all red ear, they have 2 different food sources. So they call them shellcrackers because they eat things like snails and that sort of stuff. So they're eating different things than the bluegills. So you're not putting, you can support both without wiping out. They're not competing with each other. Some of the other, what I could call the also-rans that are kind of sometimes used. So channel catfish, and again, power in to put channel catfish in. There's no problem here either because again they have a completely different niche than the fish you're putting in. So you're just taking advantage of that. Just putting another species into this pond. Occasionally what we use is this fish called grass carp. Grass carp is potentially an invasive species, but it's not because the grass carp eggs are, when they're hatched, they're irradiated, causes them to be sterile. Okay, so grass carp are complete herbivores and will feed on pond vegetation. Remember, we're not exactly real fond of pond vegetation. It has some good advantages, but it also has some bad advantages. The fact that it's going to kill the pond. So grass carp, they're also known as white allure, by the way, in case you hear another name, are good at controlling some of the weeds in the ponds. This is what a grass carp looks like when they get to be huge fish, by the way. So this one on the right, you got to be careful. So that's the size you stock at. But if you have bass in the pond, they can hit that size. So you got to be kind of careful. You don't want to be feeding grass carp to the bass. These are the ones you do not want to have in this size pond. Again, there are some places where these fish are desirable, but if we're talking about these managed ponds of about an acre or 2, these are not fish that you want to have. Most common one, and again, you go down to Reelfoot Lake, and there's a whole culture of people that live on crappie fishing. So that's the crappie fishing guys. Everybody must have fished crappie. So there's a white crappie and a black crappie. I'm not going to expect you to tell them apart. But crappie are fast-growing fish. They reproduce quickly, and so in a small pond they can quickly take over. And they'll outcompete a lot of the small fish for food sources. So they can be a real problem. Another one, these are shiners. A lot of people will throw these into their pond. using them as, try to feed their fish to make them bigger. It sort of kind of works unless it doesn't. These fish, if they escape, if they don't all get eaten, then you've got a new problem in your pond. Now again, they'll be competing with your fish with your fish fry when they're young. These are carp, two different kinds of standard carp. One's the Asian carp, one's the Israeli carp. The carp are often referred to as rough fish, or some of the rough fish, because they'll tear up the bottom and muddy the waters. Again, some places in the world, fishing for carp is done. I don't mind the taste of carp, but they can be a real problem. This is not a regular catfish. This is a bullhead. So it's in the same family as channel catfish, but they're much smaller. There's yellows. This is a black bullhead. There's also brown bullheads, and they are they're very good at raising large numbers of. First of all, they're not much of a game species. Some brown bullhead will get big enough, but blacks and yellows don't get that big. They're young. They have a very high reproductive rate because they use parental care. So they protect their young from any predators, and they do extremely well, so they can take over a pond. Okay. How to stock them? Okay. So the general rule of thumb is, we talked about this, we mentioned this, some of you got this right at the pond. The general rule of thumb is basically you're talking about a biomass ratio in terms of weight of 10 to 1, and that's a standard ecological number, works very, very well. So for every pound of largemouth bass, you need to be stocking 10 pounds of bluegill or bluegill slash red ear. Okay. Usually when it's done is, and these are just some standard methods. Okay, so if you stock in the late fall, and that's usually what's happening, you're stocking fingerlings, which are very small fish, and it's pretty much based on, you get 500, basically about 500 fish or 500, whatever your weight total is per acre. With catfish, you put a tenth of that, and then of course, I don't have it written there, but bass will also be at 50 fish per acre too. So those of the numbers, that's probably late fall stocking is probably the best. So I don't even think I want to really talk about some of those other numbers. They're not important because we're not going to fertilize anyway. But the whole idea here is those fish will be ready for harvesting in about 2 or 3 years. Everything will be going fine. So yes, the important numbers are there are 500 to 50. Even though it says catfish, pretend it says bass. This is a quicker way of doing it, and that's basically, I'm not going to talk much about this way because it doesn't always work. So I'm just going to go with my late fall stocking. This is the early spring stocking. The idea is to try to get you up there faster, but we're not going to worry about that. Okay, some of the ideas about fish pond management. So what you're after is, you want to be able to sustain the pond. So where you're taking fish, you're getting good sized fish, and you're not hurting the fishery by doing this. And it's a real dance. It's real hard to do. You really got to keep a watch on the pond if you want these, which is what we want: sustained improvement, sustained yields. One of the big problems we see all the time is what happens generally is people tend to overfish the largemouth bass. That's the standard problem. They're basically taking too many. So if you look at that, if you have a pond and you've got some big largemouth bass, where you've got, let's say, 5-pounders, okay, really you should only be taking 4 fish out of that pond a year. again, it's really hard to try to explain that to people, because you're knocking out, that's a huge amount of fish. Okay. The biggest important thing, and of course this never happens, keeping records becomes extremely important to deal with this sort of thing. But, so problem number one is taking too many bass. But if you do take too many bass, the next problem is then the bluegill get loose. Okay, and so, when that happens, they start crowding. You start noticing that they're stunted, and so basically, the way you crop them. So if you're taking out, let's say in a pond, if you're taking out 20 pounds of largemouth bass per year, you should be taking 100 pounds of these guys out. It's basically a multiplier. If you don't, then they start crowding. So, how do you check this? This is what Colorado wanted us to do, but I didn't feel like it was too cold. There's only 4 of us. I didn't feel like it. So, and it's a little late in the year to be doing this anyway. Seine hauls are best done in the summer for all sorts of reasons here. What you're doing with a seine haul is you're looking at stuff near the shore, so you're looking at recruitment. So basically you make several hauls and you pull out the fish and you see what you get. So if you get lots of small bluegill, some small bass, and then some good sized bluegill like you see here. So lots of small bass, and by small I mean small in length, not in thickness. So this is the sort of seine haul you want to see here. I'm seeing lots of little fish, a few big ones and all that. So if I get that, the pond is good. I'm happy. Okay. If I don't see any real small bluegill or bass, I get semi-small, 3 to 5 inch sunfish, and that's about all I'm getting. That's telling you you're overcrowded. That's the sunfish are overcrowding your pond. And this one here is many small bluegill, no small bass, and 3 to 5 inch sunfish. And what's happening here is your bass are now overcrowding. So you're not going to see them in the nets, but they're knocking everything off. So it's less likely to kill the 3 to 5 inches. So this is a problem. There's more than one way of measuring a pond. This is just the first one. This is by doing, these are what you get from shoreline seine hauls. There are other ways to look at what your pond looks like too. Probably the most common is what are known as creel surveys. Okay. Creel is, if you remember the old-fashioned fishermen, where they would fly fish and all that, they would put their fish in this wicker basket that had lined with moss. It's very nice and all that. That's called a creel. So basically, a creel survey is just keeping an idea on what you're catching. So you're going for a completely different group of fish. So you're looking at angling success. So if you're keeping records of what you're collecting from your pond, you're doing a creel survey. Okay. And generally, you want to see largemouth bass at about 1 to 2 pounds. If you're getting a lot of those in the lake, and good size, almost slab size sunfish. These are all good signs you want to see. Problem signs, it depends on what's going on. If you're out fishing and all you catch are small bluegill or a few very small bass, or very few very large bass. So the small ones are out, they're competing with the bluegill. If you get, every now and then you get a real big bass and then lots of small bluegill, that's overcrowded by bluegill. This is a problem. The next one is large bluegill and small and thin bass. This is what we're starting to notice on Peller's Pond. That his bass are starting to get a little bit overcrowded, and so this year we went after bass a little harder, hit younger ones.
try to take him out of the pond. But I would like to do a seine haul to see if how much recruiting he's getting with the small bluegill. Another classic way, if you ever taken ichthyology or worked with Dr. Blanchard, he does a lot of electroshocking. Electroshocking is a way of, basically what it is it's a whole science. There's two different ways of doing it. There's those that use direct current, those who use alternating current. How much current you use becomes important. So a lot of people think what you do is you just shock the heck out of the pond to get as many things as you can. That's all well and good, but it's not comparable. See, there's certain rules that you have to follow. You can't, different ways of doing it. There's in this case here, they're using what's called a backpack shocker. There's seine shockers, which are the net lights up. There's fish boat shockers, depending on what you're doing. The purpose for it is to collect fish with a low mortality rate. They're still dying, but they're just not dying as bad as if you're keeping all the fish. So the idea is hopefully they're going to do catch and release. Certain species die faster than others. White bass, striped bass, they're shocked and it tends to break their backs. So you get bigger yields, and it's more effective than seine hauling because you're getting, you're sampling the entire fish community instead of either near shore or catchable fish. All right, so let's talk about how we solve some of these common problems. Okay, if you're overcrowded by small bluegill, you got to get rid of the small bluegill. Okay, so problem number one is leave the bass alone. Don't take any more bass. Secondly, since normally seining is used as a tool to look at how your pond is doing, you can also use it as a means to catch bluegill and try to get them out of the pond. So using a seine net to do that is kind of labor intensive, one way. And I think the best way, do I have it on here? Okay, well, bass stocking is good too. You can increase the number of bass you have in the pond, so that's good too. This is the big one. This is probably the best tool that you can use for pond management, and a lot of people never use it, and that's drawing the lake down, specifically in winter. How does that help? Well, first of all, what it does, the reason why the small bluegill are doing so well is because they're so small, they can get up into the grasses on the shore, and the bass can't get to them. When you draw everything down, you force them out into the main water, and the bass can start hammering them. So that's one of the reasons. There's a whole bunch of reasons for winter drawdown. I'll be talking a little bit more about that as I go along. Okay. So if you get that cleaned up, what happens is the bass will do better. There won't be a lot of bass, but they'll usually after winter drawdown, especially, you're going to get a few really big sized bass in those ponds. These are a couple of pictures of. This is what the telltale sign of largemouth bass when they're overcrowding. Just look at the girth of the belly. So this is not a good thing. These fish are starving. Okay. So if you got too many of those, the first thing is to start. Normally you don't take fish from 6 to 12 inches. You only take larger fish than that. But now you got to start dropping some of those. Again, some of them you can get by seining, but most of them you're going to get by fishing. And we want to keep it in mind is oftentimes if your problem is too many bass, somebody else might have a problem with too few bass. And so since stocking is an answer, you can basically just take your fish over to somebody else's pond and solve two problems at once. Again, winter drawdowns helps this case as well too, because it's going to increase the food source for these fish. These are the dangerous approaches that I do not subscribe to, but they're often done here because they think that these are fast cures. One is start to provide feeder fish. So start dumping shiners into these ponds, which is a real problem if they get caught, if they get started up. Then you're going to have to drain the whole pond and start all over again. And of course, fertilization, the idea of increasing the food base. This is, if you're thinking about these ponds as bottom-up control, I increase the fertilization, increases the algae, increases the zooplankton, increases the food to the fish. And by now, Dr. Greenwood has beaten it through your heads that, yeah, you increase the algae, but it's not the good stuff, it's the bad stuff. Okay. And this is sort of switch over to some things about water quality then. Okay. So that should have popped up there. Okay. So critical parameters is the pH should be circumneutral. In this part of the country, the pH usually runs almost dead on 7, maybe sometimes down about 6.5. But we don't, so it stays circumneutral. And alkalinity, so what this is basically, this is a measure, alkalinity of how much carbonates are in the water here. And at that pH, you'd expect carbonates to be pretty high. Our ponds tend to run soft. The alkalinity tends to be low. Ponds around here. So, but about 20 milligrams per, yeah. Dissolved oxygen, it's sort of a rule of thumb. It's for ponds like this. Now, this doesn't, people apply this rule to all sorts of different water systems and all that, and they shouldn't. Because, you know, if you could have the world's greatest wetland area, there's no way it's gonna have a DO of 5 milligrams per liter or greater. It's just not the way it works. But in these ponds, what you want to see is dissolved oxygen at 5 milligrams per liter or greater. That doesn't mean you just go out and take dissolved oxygen, it's fine. That reading has to be taken in the morning before sunrise. Okay, that's the worst possible time, is right before sunrise. And so that's, again, fish, you know, you could be over 5 the rest of the time, but that's where fish are gonna die. So you always have to check it at that time. Suspended sediment, we've been measured suspended sediment on a few different water samples here. That was always nice and low. It should never get above 100 NTU. And what are some of the possible causes? What would cause the water to be have a lot of sediment? You could have bank erosion. You can have sediment coming in through bank erosion is primarily overland flow or wind fetch, causing the shore to erode. But you can also have sediment coming in from whatever the upstream area is. I talked about the use of silt ponds, so that can be a big problem. And the third possible source of sediment are rough fish, resuspending materials in that. Lots of problems with high turbidity, gill clogging on fish. Most of the predators, bass, are site predators, so when turbidity gets high, they don't feed. So again, it's both health, so there's lots of health issues with suspended sediment. These nutrients, NPK, should be there, but not in huge amounts here. Okay. So, what do you have water quality problems? Okay. So one of these is oftentimes we're dealing with pH and alkalinity. Usually the problem with pH is it's too low. And so what's often done is the pond is buffered. So what they're doing here, they've got this little barge, and it's covered up with limestone, with ground up limestone. And they have a pump, and they're washing the limestone off the barge into the pond with the idea of trying to raise the pH by neutralizing the acid. Okay. Dissolved oxygen, of course, is a big problem. Too many fish kills. It's too low, you get fish kills. This is actually a fish kill in Pacer Pond. So what sometimes can happen is you can get big runoffs, and you get algae grows like crazy, dissolved oxygen shoots way up, which is fine and dandy and wonderful, but at night it crashes. And so you go through that low period and the fish die. In some ponds, not around here, where you have dimictic lakes that overturn, you can get fish kills when those lakes are overturning. Lots of additions for that, a lot of people do that, or, probably all seen so many people's ponds, they have a fountain in the middle or something, but that's just to aerate the water. So, those sort of things. There's connections to tractors that a lot of times especially in managed aquaculture ponds, they just spin these paddles around and try to increase the amount of dissolved oxygen that way. And the diverter is a big help with that, because what it's doing is it's taking low oxygenated water out of the pond, which then increases basically the percent of oxygenated water is increasing because deoxygenated water is decreasing. So that's a big plus. With turbidity, of course, I showed Dr. Peller's pond because it was extremely turbid for a while. The main thing with turbidity, how you get rid of it, is find out why you have a turbidity problem, and to eliminate that. So I have erosion on the shoreline, which is what caused this turbidity problem here is caused by shoreline erosion. So once you got the grasses established, this was no longer a problem. Is it coming in from the upstream area? Well, then you need to build a silt pond or something like that. Is it because of resuspension of fish? Then you have to remove the rockfish. Again, so I've talked about proper pond construction has a silt pond in it, which is a big help. Okay. If the problems persist, usually if it's a mild case, there are you can treat the pond with certain chemicals that cause cause the soil particles, the sediment to group together and fall out. A tough case, you can basically withdraw water from the pond, treat it in a silt pond and return it back in. A hopeless case, you can put dye in the pond and dye it blue, which is, a lot of people do that. It's called aqua shade. They dye ponds blue just so that they look better. Where am I out of time here?
6 minutes.
Pretty good. If I can get all this done, then we don't have to class later on. Okay, fertilization. Okay, so again, this is what people are thinking about. This is what goes on in the head of a fertilizer here. He knows that he's got to put this big base in, which increases all these phytoplankton here, which increases the zooplankton and small insects, crustaceans, and that, which is then going to increase the small feeder fish, which then increases the largemouth bass, and so the apex predator. Humans do well. So that's the way they tend to think about these systems, but that's actually not what's happening. Okay? Again, it's usually a mistake, and the result is in this part of the world, your pond is usually getting plenty of nutrients. It might be low in nitrogen, but because they tend to be high in phosphorus. And then it ends up with these dangerous algal blooms and bacterial blooms that can kill your fish. Also, this is another big one too here. Fertilization, I mean, our ponds, basically here, our ponds, the pH has to be pretty high. The higher the pH is, if you're running circumneutral around 6.5 or 7, that's not enough. That pH is going to keep, the fertilizer is going to stay bound up. It's not going to go into the pond. Also, alkalinity is rarely that high in our ponds around here. And you need high alkalinity. And so basically you're just filling the pond in, you're wasting money. The last part of the stuff, I think we're getting pretty close to the end. Aquatic vegetation, ponds here. Again, we have a love-hate relationship with aquatic vegetation. Some of the good points, it provides habitat heterogeneity. It's a wonderful place. Small fish use it for refuge, large fish use it because small fish are using it for refuge. It adds heterogeneity, it adds oxygen to the systems, it does a lot of good things. The bad points are, this is basically, this is succession in action. Your pond is filling in. When the vegetation goes, it can also remove all sorts of material from the oxygen from the water. It's a pain in the butt to fish in, so all sorts of problems, the bad side too. Again, that's a fish kill
in a highly, that's water primrose, which is a big problem around here. But again, that's a morning shot, the fish have died sometime in the night. Ways to control it, okay? One, which is probably one of the more common ways, are herbicides, and oftentimes the herbicides use copper compounds, which is a real problem. So they basically spray these things out that way. I'll save that for later. So, herbicide usage has to be probably the best. There's some aquatic forms of Roundup now, like rodeo, that are used on ponds, and you can't just go through and spray an entire pond. Because what will happen is all that vegetation will die at the same time, and you'll have a fish kill because of oxygen loss. So it has to be done slowly in certain areas, allow the pond, with monitoring the dissolved oxygen, to allow the pond time to come back. This is probably the way most people like to do it because it's easy. Yeah. Copper compounds, however, once you've done that, you can't eat the fish. Another way is shading. Sometimes you get some shade. This is kind of tough to do. Somehow shade the water. What you're trying to get rid of are attached vegetation at the bottom. So what you're trying to do is limit the amount of light that gets to the bottom to that vegetation. So shade cloth can do that. Fertilizing the pond, believe it or not, by increasing the amount of phytoplankton in the pond, you basically shade what's down below. And then here's again the use of aqua shade to dye the pond to try to keep the light from getting into there. Biological control, this is probably, I think, the best approach, but grass carp don't eat everything. But there are certain pathogens that are put on the plants that will kill the plants. Biological, certain things lead it. And of course, grass carp, if you can get them to feed on it, they're pretty good. So there's some other fish that feed too, but they're not usually used, like tilapia. So, but grass carp are, if you're getting the ones that have been irradiated, they're pretty good to use. That's where I'll end, right there.